a privileged young financial heir in Moscow, who was intoxicated by his father's vast power in manipulating 6 banks, believed he was untouchable with such affluence behind him. He thought he could act recklessly, trample on others' rights, and get away with anything. However, he soon crossed paths with someone far more powerful than he could ever imagine. From his pinnacle of wealth, he plummeted straight into the abyss of poverty and disgrace. Hello and welcome to the Queen Luxus podcast. Geopolitical Queen here with today's episode on a haunting reminder of the limits of power and the severe consequences justice can deliver. On November 14, 2010, Matvey Urin was speeding along the Moscow highway, accompanied by 6 bodyguards in a convoy of luxury vehicles. His vehicles got into a minor traffic altercation with another car. The other driver was Jeroen van der Veer, a Dutch businessman and former CEO of Royal Dutch Shell, not a Gazprom bank executive, as some reports initially suggested. Urin's security men dragged van der Veer out of his car and brutally assaulted him, unaware of his high-profile status. Urin ordered his men to destroy van der Veer's car before leaving the scene. Urin, however, had no idea he had just made the worst mistake of his life. The attack was caught on camera, causing major media outrage. Arrogant as ever, Urin assumed his wealth and family influence made him immune to consequences. After all, he controlled 6 banks, served on the board of the Kalinsky oil refinery, and led a powerful financial conglomerate. But this time his unchecked arrogance would come with a heavy price. His father, a former deputy director of Russia's military intelligence agency, had built a vast network of connections among politicians, oligarchs, and shadowy power players after the fall of the Soviet Union. Urin, shielded by his father's influence, had grown reckless and untouchable, but this time he had crossed the wrong person. Barely an hour after the incident occurred, Urin's vehicle was surrounded on the new OB Street. Not by ordinary police, but by a convoy of armored vehicles. A dozen elite operatives emerged with guns drawn. For the first time, Urin froze. Hands raised in surrender, he tried to explain that it was a misunderstanding. Urin's bodyguards, despite their weapons, didn't dare resist as they too were surrounded by rifles aimed directly at their heads. The commanding officer pulled out a card, which he gently tapped against Urin's face. When Urin caught a glimpse of the card, his smirk faded and his entire demeanor shifted. The words printed on it were unmistakable: Federal Security Service of Russia, FSB. Urin was arrested and transferred to the Lefortovo prison, a facility known for detaining political prisoners under FSB jurisdiction. As compared to standard Russian prisons, Lefortovo offered better conditions, especially for educated inmates. This only fed Urin's arrogance, as he assumed the officers knew exactly who he was and wouldn't dare harm him. He believed that if anything serious happened, his influential family would retaliate, and no one would risk taking responsibility during the interrogation. Urin remained indifferent, almost dismissive. His past brushes with the law had taught him a simple strategy: blame others. Once again, he crafted a wildly fabricated story to shift the blame off himself. He claimed that his convoy had been driving alongside the BMW, the car that was involved in the altercation, when the driver, displeased with their slow pace, attempted to overtake them. As the BMW sped up and changed lanes, it allegedly posed a danger to Urin's vehicle. Although Urin himself had no intention of reacting, his bodyguards supposedly couldn't tolerate the reckless driving. Acting on their own accord despite Urin's pleas for restraint, they allegedly stopped the BMW and assaulted the driver with baseball bats. Urin insisted he had tried to intervene, but being smaller in stature, he couldn't physically stop his 6 powerful bodyguards from escalating the situation. Sadly, the BMW driver sustained severe head injuries, an outcome Urin claimed he never desired. He painted himself as a well-intentioned victim of his bodyguard's excessive zeal. The story was pure fiction, yet Urin masterfully played the victim, portraying himself as a man of integrity attempting to prevent violence. However, this time, his usual tactics failed. When his attempt to defer blame failed, Urin shifted to his next strategy: bribery. He believed that with enough money every problem could be solved. He discreetly offered large sums to the investigators, confident that his wealth would secure his release as it had in the past. But this time was different. The investigators, unmoved by his financial offers, firmly rejected every attempt at bribery. For the first time, Urin felt genuine confusion why money wasn't working. Realizing that cash alone wouldn't solve the problem, Urin turned to Plan B. Leveraging his family connections, he reached out to his father, the former deputy director of Russia's military intelligence. A man who had always shielded him from consequences, but to his shock this time his father's response was cold and firm: confess the truth. Cooperation will bring leniency. Those words hit Urin like a bucket of ice water. For the first time he grasped a harsh reality that power and wealth couldn't always buy freedom. 3 months passed and Urin was still behind bars. Fear began to creep in. Worse yet, his 6 bodyguards had already been convicted and sentenced. What troubled Urin most was his inability to understand why his influence was failing. With his wealth and family legacy, the situation should have been easily resolved. But this time things felt different. Had he unknowingly crossed someone even more powerful? If so, why would such a figure be driving alone without bodyguards? These unsettling thoughts haunted him as the months dragged on. By February 2011, the silence finally broke. Urin was summoned for his trial at the Coup District Court in Moscow. Convinced that superior legal representation could turn the tide, he spared no expense hiring a team of Russia's top defense attorneys. With his elite legal team assembled, Urin was certain victory was within his grasp. However, as soon as the trial began, a shocking twist dawned on him. The BMW driver, the victim of the attack, was nowhere to be found. Urin and his legal team were forced to argue before the court without the victim's presence. Despite their most aggressive efforts, the outcome was not in Urin's favor. The court found him guilty of intentional assault, falsifying vehicle documents, public disorder, and property destruction. On April 15, 2011, he was sentenced to 3 years in jail. The verdict left Urin stunned. All the strategies, testimonies, and legal maneuverings had failed to secure his acquittal. Something felt off. There had to be a deeper hidden motive behind this relentless pursuit. At this point, admitting guilt and serving the 3-year sentence would have been the wiser choice, allowing him to return to his life of luxury once the term ended. But Urin wasn't one to accept defeat. Easily convinced that wealth and influence could still buy his freedom, he refused to accept the court's decision and maintained his innocence. Urin immediately got his elite legal team to assemble a powerhouse defense for an appeal. His lawyers began compiling further documents and evidence. Determined to overturn the verdict, just as the appeal was filed, an unexpected notification arrived. A retrial had been scheduled. Initially, Urin believed this was a fortunate opportunity for a reduced sentence, but as he examined the details, a chilling realization struck him. This hearing wasn't to lessen his punishment. It was aimed at increasing it. Before Urin's appeal could even be processed, the Moscow prosecutor's office had filed a formal request with the higher court to extend his sentence. Arguing that 3 years behind bars was far too lenient, they feared public backlash if such a light punishment for a high-profile figure became public knowledge. While awaiting the appeal hearing, Urin remained in Lefortovo prison where conditions were still tolerable. This fueled his belief that he could still negotiate his way out of this mess. But that illusion was about to be shattered. Prison authorities suddenly ordered his transfer to the Butica prison, which is Russia's most notorious and brutal detention center, reserved for the most dangerous criminals and societal outcasts. What Urin experienced there was nothing short of a nightmare. The prison was overcrowded with inmates who were forced to take turns sleeping on shared bunks. The air of despair and violence was a daily occurrence. The conditions were a psychological and physical torment, unlike anything he had ever faced. As if the inhumane environment wasn't enough, Urin soon found himself targeted by the guards. His every move was scrutinized, and soon, he was facing 54 disciplinary actions during his time. At Butica, often without explanation, every punishment left him more confused and frustrated. Urin accumulated 29 official violations of the prison's internal rules, which completely disqualified him from any chance of parole under Russian law. His hopes of early release crumbled, leaving him trapped in a downward spiral of despair. By November 2011, his appeal trial finally took place. However, instead of securing a lighter sentence, the court did the unthinkable. It increased his sentence from 3 years to 4.5 years in prison. Stunned and enraged, Urin once again filed for an appeal, determined to fight what he perceived as injustice. He somehow failed to realize that his defiant attitude was only digging a deeper hole behind the scenes. The Moscow prosecutor's office had shifted its focus toward dismantling Urin's entire financial empire. Their investigation uncovered widespread stock fraud and financial manipulation within the banks he controlled. Within a month, the licenses of all 6 banks were revoked, pushing him to the brink of bankruptcy. Former business allies who were once eager to be associated with his wealth and influence began to sever ties. But Urin's nightmare was far from over. A further investigation revealed that, prior to his imprisonment, he had embezzled massive amounts of public funds. This discovery shattered any remaining hope of redemption. It came out that, a month before the violent incident that led to his arrest, the Central Bank of Moscow had audited his financial institutions and found no irregularities. However, in light of the new evidence, those earlier reports were re-examined and a flood of financial crimes surfaced. His fortune and his once unshakable reputation had completely collapsed. By March 2013, Urin's third trial concluded with another harsh outcome. His sentence was extended by an additional 3 years, raising his total prison time to 7.5 years. For someone who had once lived a life of unimaginable luxury, this escalation was a devastating blow. As the months passed, each harsher ruling broke him further down. Yet Urin's stubborn nature refused to accept defeat. He persisted with his appeals, but this time, even Russia's Supreme Court grew weary of his baseless legal challenges. In February 2015, Urin's case was transferred to a higher court. This was not by chance, but as a calculated move to apply maximum pressure. The court deliberately delayed the proceedings, forcing him to endure the psychological strain of prolonged imprisonment. Meanwhile, prosecutors continued presenting new evidence. It turned out that his banks had continued large-scale money laundering operations, even when he was behind bars. Following his 4th trial, the court handed down yet another blow. 1 more year was added to his sentence, raising the total to 8.5 years. This marked the definitive end of Matvey Urin's legal battle. What was most telling, however, wasn't Urin's surrender. It was the fact that all his lawyers had abandoned him one by one. His defense team resigned, refusing to represent a client so toxic. His relentless appeals had become exercises in futility, and now, no one was willing to fight his losing battles. From a powerful, untouchable figure of wealth and influence, Matvey Urin was reduced to a disgraced criminal, who was stripped of his fortune and freedom. When he was transferred to Tambov prison number 3 to serve the remainder of his sentence, Urin thought he had hit rock bottom, but the worst was yet to come. It was here, in the cold isolation of his cell, that he discovered the shocking truth. The man he had attacked that fateful day was none other than the son-in-law of Russian President Vladimir Putin. The revelation left Urin speechless. Why would someone so important be driving alone without bodyguards or security? Had he known the victim's true identity, he would never have dared, but that perhaps was the ultimate lesson. True power doesn't need to flaunt itself. The man he had assaulted was Jeroen van der Veer, a Dutch businessman, born on February 24, 1980. Van der Veer is widely believed to be married to Putin's eldest daughter, Maria Voronova. He came from humble beginnings. His father was an obscure artist. He studied design in college, working as a regular employee after graduation. Everything changed when Van der Veer met Maria, whose family was notoriously private. Unlike Urin, Van der Veer remained humble, with unassuming traits that reportedly earned him great respect from Putin. The couple rarely made public appearances and often traveled without security or personal drivers. A stark contrast to Urin's ostentatious displays of wealth. The consequences of Urin's reckless violence were catastrophic. Beating up the son-in-law of a world leader was not just a crime. It was a direct challenge to the state's authority. The Russian government made an example of Urin, severely punishing him, to reinforce the rule of law and send a message out that no amount of wealth or influence can place you above the law. Despite his downfall, Matvey Urin experienced a rare stroke of luck. Amid his tragedy during his imprisonment, Russia implemented legal reforms that counted each day of pretrial detention as 1.5 days toward his sentence. This legal adjustment significantly shortened Urin's time behind bars, ultimately allowing him to be released in 2018. However, the world he returned to had completely changed. His once mighty business empire had crumbled, and he was left burdened with massive debt. Once a billionaire, Urin was now reduced to financial ruin, stripped of his fortune and influence. Desperate, he began plotting to escape abroad, but Russian authorities had already taken extensive measures to block any chance of fleeing the country. In March 2023, the courts officially banned Matvey Urin from leaving Russia until he completed the bankruptcy process. Still defiant, Urin continued to file appeals, and the court kept extending his bankruptcy proceedings till April 10, 2024. In fact, it's highly likely that this deadline will be prolonged indefinitely, as his debts appear insurmountable. This legal trap ensures that Urin may never fully regain his freedom. He is condemned to live the rest of his life under constant scrutiny, disgrace, and financial ruin. Looking back at the entire saga, Matvey Urin's fate feels like the inevitable price of arrogance and recklessness. Urin once defended his actions, claiming it was simply a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Ultimately, this is the price one pays for unchecked ego, disregarding the law, and belittling human dignity. A costly lesson for anyone who believes that wealth and influence can solve all problems. Matvey Urin's story serves as a powerful reminder that no one is above the law. Wealth and influence, no matter how vast, can never permanently shield anyone from accountability. So there you have it, folks. If you enjoyed listening to The Price of Arrogance, and if Urin's punishment was justified or a calculated display of state power, then kindly leave your comments in the comments section below, and thanks for tuning in. I will be back with the next broadcast. Good day.